that time, to ask a question, press star 1 on your phone and record your name at the prompt. Today's call is being recorded. If you have any objections, you may disconnect at this time. I would now like to turn the call over to Andrew Haight. Thank you. You may begin.
Thank you so much. And thank you to all of you for attending this afternoon's webinar. My name is Andy Haight. I'm an economist here at the U.S. Census Bureau at our headquarters office. And today we're here to talk with you all about the 2017 Economic Census, and specifically about the local area data that we are releasing right now for the utilities sector. To get us started, I want to provide a little bit of background about the U.S. Census Bureau. You'd have to be living under a rock to not know that we are getting ready to conduct the largest peacetime mobilization that we do here in the United States. This week and the beginning of next week, the Census Bureau will start mailing out forms or postcards to nearly every household in America. Those postcards will be an invitation to respond to the population census via the webinar, or excuse me, via the website or via a phone number. Some folks will receive the actual paper form from us, and they'll be able to complete that form and mail it in. A relatively small percentage of Americans will receive nothing from us in the mail. They will instead receive an enumerator, a census taker that will come to their house and will ask them the questions that would normally be asked on this form. But the decennial census, the population census, is just one of more than 130 programs that we actually conduct here at the Census Bureau. In addition to doing the complete population count every 10 years, we also do a program called the American Community Survey, or the ACS. The American Community Survey is our largest demographic survey that we conduct here at the Census Bureau. Publishes data on more than 2,000 different variables, dozens of topics, trillions of estimates. It's really a fantastic source of demographic, socioeconomic, and housing data that are available from the Census Bureau. But in addition to those demographic, those household-based surveys, we also conduct 58 business surveys. Those business surveys include the Census of Governments and the Economic Census. And it's the Economic Census that we're here to talk about today. So let's talk a little bit about those 58 different surveys that we talked about. At the very top of the pyramid are our monthly and quarterly surveys. The Census Bureau conducts 17 of the 22 leading economic indicator surveys that you hear about on the evening news every evening. These include surveys like the monthly retail trade survey that publishes information on the retail sector, retail sales. It includes our monthly imports and exports data that we publish in our trade programs. And it includes a variety of other monthly and quarterly topics. Below those surveys, we have our annual programs. These surveys provide more information that are available in the monthly and quarterly surveys, and they allow us to be able to look at trend type data. But at the bottom of the pyramid is sort of the baseline benchmark survey that we conduct here at the Census Bureau, and that is the Economic Census. Every 5 years, we conduct a complete census of every employer business in the United States. And that Economic Census then acts as the baseline or the benchmark for nearly all of those annual, quarterly, and monthly surveys that are sitting on top of it. So it's very important that we get a very thorough count of all of those businesses and that we have the most accurate data available, because the accuracy of the Economic Census then impacts those other monthly and quarterly and annual programs. When we think about the Economic Census is our most comprehensive and complete program that we conduct because it has a number of characteristics that are unique to it. First of all, the Economic Census covers nearly every single 2 through 6-digit NAICS code covered by the U.S. Census Bureau. NAICS, or North American Industry Classification System, is the codes that we use to classify every business in the United States. The Census Bureau does have some exclusions from our Economic Census. The big exclusion, as you can see on the slide, is agriculture. We do not publish any data at the Census Bureau for NAICS 11, or very, very little data for NAICS 11, because the U.S. Department of Agriculture publishes data in the Census of Agriculture through the National Agricultural Statistics Service. As you can see, I've also provided a link here to a list of other exclusions. They exclude things like colleges and universities that we don't collect data for because the National Center for Education Statistics does. We don't have data for the U.S. Postal Service, another exclusion because the data are available from another source as well. But for the most part, the Economic Census covers nearly every industry. The Economic Census is also the most detailed geographic program that we conduct at the Census Bureau. Those monthly and quarterly surveys are primarily national level data only. There are two that do have data below the national level, but the lion's share of them are just national programs. The Economic Census is unique in that it publishes data at the full nation, state, metropolitan area, county, and even place level. The term place refers to cities, towns, villages, and boroughs, which is our sort of generic term for every type of local community. And it would not only include incorporated cities, municipalities, but it even includes something that we call a census-designated place, or a CDP. The town that I live in is not actually a real municipality in Maryland. Crofton, Maryland is actually a census-designated place. So we publish in the Economic Census data on both incorporated cities and on those census-designated places. In the Economic Census, we only publish data for places of 2,500 population or more. So those really little tiny towns in the United States that have fewer than 2,500 people would not be covered by the Economic Census. Now, one important point I want to make about this level of geographic detail that is available from the Economic Census is that level of geographic detail varies widely by sector. As you'll see in just a few minutes, the utility sector is actually the smallest sector in the United States. It has the least number of businesses. So when we start publishing data below the national and state levels, there are many, many cases where even at the metropolitan area level, there may only be one or two utility businesses in that particular metro, in that particular county, or even in that particular city. And in those cases, we are required by Title 13 of the U.S. Code to suppress the data for that particular industry. So the first tip I want to provide to you all today is when you're looking at data for the utility sector, I would highly encourage you all to start off first at the national and state level and look at the data at the 2- and 3-digit NAICS code levels for the utility sector. Then, after you've confirmed that we are publishing data at the national and state level, those details then drill down to the metro area, county, and place. I talk to a lot of users who often will say, Andy, I tried to pull up the data for every city and town in Maryland for the utilities data, and I tried to look at a particular NAICS code within utilities, and I didn't get any results back. What happened? And I always tell them, you're looking at data that's just so fine, it's just such a small industry, such a small sector, that we couldn't publish the data because of the privacy. That's your first tip. Now, in addition to geography and industry, the Economic Census also publishes data by other dimensions. We publish data in 4 different tabulations by business size. That is the size of the business as classified by employment size and by revenue size. And we also classify the business by company size or firm size and by establishment size. An establishment is a single business at a single physical location. These size data are available for the utility sector, but again, just as it is with the geography level breakouts, the size data does get really thin in some of those smaller size categories, and you'll actually see that. We do publish data by franchise status in the Economic Census. I will say that we don't actually have any franchise data for the utility sector. I'm not aware of there being any franchising opportunities, if you will, in the utility sector, but we do have franchise data for many, many other sectors. The Economic Census is also our most detailed survey because it has the most detailed data variables. We publish over 200 data variables in the Economic Census. These include core statistics like the number of establishments. Again, that's a number of businesses. An establishment is a business at a single physical location. We publish data on employment, on payroll, and some measure of output of the business, whether that is sales, shipments, receipts, revenue, or work done for the construction sector. We also have detailed sector-specific variables. In the manufacturing sector, for example, we have detailed information on inventories and assets and capital expenditures, etc. Some of those detailed variables are available for the utilities data as well. Now, the next thing that we publish in the Economic Census is something called product lines data. Product lines are the detailed products and services provided by a particular business. And we tailor those product line breakouts to each industry. So, for example, the questions that we would ask a grocery store that would ask them what kind of products does your business sell, those questions are very different than what we would ask for a doctor's office or, in this case, a utilities business. We do publish product lines data for the utility sector, but again, it's fairly limited, again, because of those privacy concerns. Finally, the last point I want to make on this slide is that the Economic Census is disseminated in a number of different data tools on the Census Bureau's website. Historically, we've published our data on American Fact Finder as being our primary release vehicle for the Economic Census. As many of you have already heard, American Fact Finder is being retired on March 31st. American Fact Finder, or AFF, as we like to call it, is being replaced by the new data.census.gov platform. If you have not already started using data.census.gov, I would highly encourage you all to check that out, because this will be the only place where you're going to now be able to get those data from the Economic Census. Well, not the only, but a main place. The data are also available on Census Business Builder and on some of our other Census Bureau tools, including QuickFacts. Now, at the bottom of the slide, I have a quick note here that we also publish data on the race, ethnicity, gender, and veteran status of the business owner in two of our surveys, the Survey of Business Owners and the Annual Survey of Entrepreneurs. These two surveys are both being replaced and completely replaced by a survey called the Annual Business Survey, or ABS. The first release of ABS is scheduled for this spring. So I would encourage you all, if you're interested in looking at data on race, ethnicity, gender, and veteran status of the business owner, to check that out. The data for the utility sector is going to, again, be pretty thin because there's very, very few minority or women-owned utility businesses. They do exist, but there's not very many of them. So let's talk a little bit about the utility sector itself. On the left-hand side of the screen is a quick extraction of the definition of what the utility sector includes. The utility sector comprises businesses that provide a variety of utility services. These include electric power, natural gas, steam, water, and even sewage removal. Those kinds of businesses are all included in the scope of the utility sector. Within that sector, the types of activities that these businesses do vary widely from utility by utility. Electric power would include not only generating the electric power, but also the transmission and distribution of that data, of that power. Natural gas also includes distribution. Steam, provision and distribution. Water supply includes treatment and distribution. And sewage, again, includes treatment, collection, treatment, and disposal. So this just gives you a high-level picture of what the definition of the utility sector is included covers. On the right-hand side of the screen is a quick screenshot from our first look report, which is the very first set of data that we released from the 2017 Economic Census. These data were released in September of last year, and these first look numbers will be completely superseded by national level data published at the end of our local area data releases, our geographic area statistics releases. So I just want to remind everybody that what we're looking at here are some preliminary estimates for the different sectors of the U.S. economy. As you can see on this slide, the utility sector is the smallest of the sectors that we publish data for in the Economic Census. There are only 17,595 establishments in this particular sector. So the comment I was making to you before about how the data that we publish at the national and state level start to get thinner and thinner and thinner when you get down to individual metros and counties and places, you can understand how that would be. For example, in the county that I live in, there is only one utility company in that entire county. So obviously, we wouldn't be able to publish data for that. There are some other interesting facts I wanted to point out about the utility sector. The utility sector not only is the smallest in terms of number of establishments, but it's also the smallest in terms of employment. There's only 663,273 people, ranked 18th of our 18 sectors in the Economic Census, and the revenue also is fairly low. It's ranked 13th with about $573.7 billion. One fact, though, that I find quite fascinating is the average annual payroll per employee. While there certainly are very, very few employees that work for the utility sector, those that do work for the utility sector are doing quite well for themselves. On average, workers in the utility sector earn, on average, $102,487. That's ranked first in the nation. So for any of you who might actually be working in the utility sector, congratulations. You're working in one of the highest paid sectors in the nation, or actually the highest paid sector in the nation. So this slide here talks a little bit about the release of data from the Economic Census. The Economic Census is released over a year and a half, nearly 2-year time frame. As I mentioned a moment ago, we started releasing data from the Economic Census in September of last year. Right now, we are in the midst of releasing what we call the geographic area statistics, and they are over on the left-hand side. We started releasing the data on January 9th, and we will continue releasing these local area data on a flow between January and November. If you are interested in learning more about this flow and determining where the state that you might be interested in learning data for the utility sector, I've provided a link here at the bottom of the screen to the release schedule where you can go in and actually look at this schedule and then dive into more details. This is the additional details that I was just alluding to. When you go to that release schedule page, you will come to a page that will give you information about the geographic area series releases that are being released. At the very top of that releases page is a release information link that provides access to an Excel file that lists all of the different sectors and states that have been released so far. Below there is a list of upcoming releases. This is, again, an Excel file that you can download that is updated every Monday that includes all of the data that are scheduled for release in the next 30 days. In between those two, what's been released and what's upcoming, there's a really nice visualization, which is seen over on the right-hand side of the screen. This hex map attempts to show all of the states in the nation, and it gives you information about what sectors and what states have been released. All of the sectors that have a peach fill, we have started releasing data for. Once that data are completely released for the entire state would then be full all the way. At the very top of this data visualization is a menu that allows you to go in and select data for a particular sector. So I've gone in here and I've selected the utility sector. So all of the states that you're seeing highlighted have the utilities data released, which accounts for about 45% of all of the data that we will release for the utility sector. You can see that 45% in the little donut chart in the bottom right-hand corner. Now, some of you may be asking, wow, I'm wondering why is it that the Census Bureau releases data for the West Coast and for the East Coast, but not the middle of the country? Why have we started on the coast and are sort of working our way toward the center? And the simple answer to this question is metro areas. When we publish data for metropolitan statistical areas at the Census Bureau, we publish data not only for the metro area as a whole, but also for each of the counties that make up that metro area. In cases where all of the counties that make up that metro area are completely enclosed within a single state, the ability for us to analyze and review the detailed data for the metro area and the detailed data for the counties is easy because it's all within the same state boundaries. But when you start talking about metro areas that straddle state boundaries, then you start running into challenges. Because in order for us to publish data for the entire metro area, we have to review the data for all the counties that make up that metro area. And when those counties spill into multiple states, we also then need to review the data for the other neighboring counties to those counties to make sure that businesses are correctly geocoded. So for example, the Washington, D.C. metropolitan area straddles 5 states: D.C., Maryland, Virginia, West Virginia, and, starting with the 2012 Economic Census, Pennsylvania. So in order for us to publish data for the utility sector for the Washington, D.C. metro area, we would have to publish the data for all 5 of those states essentially at the same time. So as you can see, that sort of is why we then start on the coasts. These coastal states have fewer metropolitan areas that straddle into their neighboring ones, and we can bundle those states as packages. When you get into the center portion of the country, like Illinois, for example, that straddles multiple states, it gets extremely hard for us to do that. So this is explained sort of why we flow the data the way we do. Now let's talk a little bit about some key changes in the Economic Census. When we are publishing data from the Economic Census, we always encourage people to ensure that the data that they are comparing over time is in fact comparable. And often the changes that occur in the Economic Census over time can affect that comparability. Geographic areas constantly change. The boundaries of counties and places and metropolitan areas change all the time, and we have resources available that help you go in and actually understand those geography changes. For the purposes of this webinar today, we're going to focus primarily on the second bullet on this slide, and that is the North American Industry Classification System changes, or those NAICS changes. Every 5 years, when we publish data on the Economic Census, we also publish data on the latest vintage of NAICS, which is also updated every 5 years. Those updates to NAICS often include new codes, or changed codes, or even sometimes deleted codes where an industry no longer has its own existence and that code is now gone. So in the next couple of slides, we'll actually walk through some of the changes that you're going to see when you look at the NAICS data. So again, NAICS, the North American Industry Classification System, is the standard that we use to classify every business in the United States. We assign a single 6-digit NAICS code to every business establishment, and we then tabulate the data according to those NAICS codes to publish the total data that we have. This system was developed by the Office of Management and Budget, but it is also a partnership with Statistics Canada and the Mexico's statistical agency, INEGI. Because it is a 3-country agreement, this allows users to compare data across those 3 North American countries. So if you are interested in looking at the utilities sector in the United States and comparing it to the utilities sector in Canada and Mexico, the data that we publish is consistent, is comparable to the data that Canada and Mexico publish as well. As I mentioned, it's updated every 5 years, and those changes include recodes, combinations, and many-to-many sort of breakouts. In some census years, we do actually have splitters, cases where a particular code was split into multiple codes, but for the 2017 Economic Census, there are none of those. So these next few slides highlight the changes that you will see when you look at data from the Economic Census. And as you can see on this slide, there were changes to the mining, the manufacturing, and the retail trade sectors. What I want to quickly mention is that there were no changes to the NAICS system for the utility sector. So that means that users can compare data between 2012 and 2017 and know that those industries are in fact 100% comparable. I always tell people, before you start making time series comparisons between our data over time, please make sure the industries you're comparing are comparable And I would even extend that to other data sources. I talk to a lot of users that use data from other, not only federal sources, but private industry sources that may not be quite as open as we are with highlighting these NAICS changes and the geographic changes that occur too. And very often they may be making a comparison between an industry that has had some type of content change where it really does make a difference. Now in 2012 NAICS, there were some brand new codes that were introduced for solar, wind, geothermal, and biomass electric power generation. And in just a few minutes, I want to highlight some of the data for 2012 and 2017 so you can see how those industries have been doing in that 5-year time frame. This is the last slide on those NAICS changes. Again, you can see we did have some changes for the information sector, real estate and rental and leasing, and the professional, scientific, and technical services. I would encourage you all to check out the NAICS website. The link is here at the bottom right of the screen to learn more about those NAICS changes. So, where can you go to actually access these data? We already mentioned this before, but I want to highlight it again. Our primary dissemination place for the Economic Census is data.census.gov. Again, I would highly encourage you all to check this out. And as you're using the tool, we would encourage you to send your feedback to the email address that's provided here at the bottom of the slide. The Economic Census data are also being added to QuickFacts and to the new release of Census Business Builder version 3.0. Now, when we release these data, we are also putting out these nice little fun facts to help users understand something about a key sector in a particular industry. These are the 2 fun facts that we have created for the utility sector so far. In the top left-hand corner, you have data for the utility sector in Arizona that talks about the average annual payroll per employment, $101,400. Again, this is a really good sector to work in terms of the average annual payroll. And in the bottom right-hand corner is utilities data for Rhode Island. In future releases, we will be releasing fun facts for the utility sector for Iowa, Kentucky, and North Dakota. If you want to see all of the fun facts that we have released so far, I've provided a link here in the upper right-hand corner to our visualizations page where you can see all of those. And we even released an America Count story on the Census Bureau's website that talks about these changes in our economy and how the Economic Census helps to measure them. Now, I want to provide a couple of key findings that we've seen so far from the 2017 Economic Census in comparison to 2012. In the upper left-hand corner, we see a chart that compares the revenue of utility companies by 3-digit NAICS code comparing 2012 to 2017. We can clearly see that the fossil fuel power generation is clearly bigger than any of the other industry groups or subsectors in this particular sector, but you can see that the fossil fuel revenue has actually declined quite a bit between 2012 and 2017. It's now about $74.7 billion, but was a little higher than that. Similarly, when you look at the employment data in the upper right-hand corner, you can see that the employment in that fossil fuel industry is, again, the most of any of the other sectors. Again, you see that similar decline in the employment in this particular subsector. But you do see that employment in the nuclear power generation subsector is quite a bit higher than some of the other ones. These 2 subsectors really dominate in terms of total employment. And finally, at the very bottom of the screen, I provided some information about the average annual payroll per employee. We've already highlighted how high this is for the sector as a whole, but you really see how high that value is when you look at some of the individual subsectors within utilities. I was somewhat amazed to see that folks who work in the nuclear power generation industry earn on average about $124,000 a year in comparison to about $107,000 for people who work in the fossil fuel power generated industries. On average, just to give you a point of comparison, the average annual payroll per employment for all industries, which is NAICS 00, is about $52,000. So this is more than double the average across all industries. I do want to remind you all that these national level data that are available here are from that first look report. So when we complete the geographic area data and then republish the national totals, some of these numbers may change slightly, again, as part of the review of the local area data. Last slide I want to provide for you here with some findings just gives you some information for the states that we have released so far. So in the left-hand side, we have some information that compares wind electric power generation in 2017 across a number of states. Again, these are the states that we have released so far, and you can clearly see that California leads these states in terms of the numbers of wind electric power generation facilities. There are actually 60 in California. This number is nearly double what it was in 2012. I was actually in California last year at a conference, and when I was driving from San Diego over to El Centro, I went over one of the mountain ranges, and the entire top of the mountain range was lined with wind turbines. It made this data kind of really interesting. I then went ahead, and since California looked so interesting, I then went in and actually pulled out the data just for California to do sort of a comparison between the hydro data, fossil fuel, solar, wind, and geothermal data for California, just to see kind of how those different ones compared. Once again, you can see how strong wind is, but even in California, the fossil fuel generated power is still dominant in that particular state. So let's go ahead now and talk about what's coming next. After we complete the geographic area statistics and release that national level publication that will supersede the first look report, we will then start releasing data from the North American Product Classification System. NAPS is the new classification system that we are using for all of our old product lines data. For those of you who might have been accustomed to using the products data from the past, you'll know that the way we publish the products data for manufacturing and mining, for construction, and for all the other sectors was different. Those three main areas each published their product lines in a very different way. Under NAPS, those areas will now all be publishing on a consistent classification system, which should make combining and comparing data across sectors easier for users. Those data are scheduled for release in November of 2020, and I would encourage you all to go to this NAPS website, the URL that I've provided, to learn more about the NAPS system in general, but also to understand what types of NAPS data are going to be available for the utilities sector. After that, we will start releasing those size tables, the establishment and firm size reports. Those will come out from November of 2020 through September of 2021. And finally, in September of 2021, we will complete by looking at the miscellaneous subjects data that include tables like class of customer, exported energy to Canada and Mexico, cost of purchased electricity for resale, and even construction activity. So if you are interested in knowing how much do utility businesses spend on construction at their own utility plants, that information is available from those miscellaneous subject reports. At the bottom of the screen, just to give you a feel for what the product data looked like in the 2012 Economic Census, this is a screenshot of just some of the product data that we published for the fossil fuel electric power generation industry, where you can see the $81 billion in total revenue, how it was then broken out by the different types of products and services that these businesses provide. Obviously, the single largest share of their revenue comes from electric generation, but you can see that these businesses also made money through distributing that electricity, through transmitting it, through providing steam or air conditioning services, through providing power marketing and brokering, etc. So these are all the different types of product data that we publish for the utility sector. So in summary, my last slide here, the Economic Census provides an amazing wealth of business data. I would encourage you all to check out this Economic Census website that I've provided the URL to learn more about the data that we publish in the Economic Census and how they are related to some of our other programs. These data are all being released on a flow basis, and there's certainly much more data that are coming. Again, I already mentioned this release website. Again, I would encourage you all to check out that site to see what's been released so far and what's coming later. Finally, the last 2 points are that the NAICS changes every 5 years. So when you're doing comparisons of data over time, I want you to check out that NAICS website to make sure the data, in fact, are comparable. And the last point here is, again, if you haven't already started using data.census.gov, you really need to start using it, because in just a couple of weeks, the American Fact Finder application will be sunsetted, and there's no 2017 Economic Census on AFF anyway. So with that, operator, I think we're actually done. Let's go ahead and see if anybody has any questions.
Thank you. We'll now begin the question and answer session. If you'd like to ask a question, please press *1 on your touch-tone phone. Make sure your phone is muted and record your name clearly when prompted. Your name will be required to introduce your question. If you need to withdraw your question, you may press *2. Again, to ask a question, please press *1 and record your name. It will take a moment for questions to come through. Please stand by. And we do have a question coming in. One moment. And our first question, your line is open.
Thank you. Andrew, great presentation. Very, very interesting. I've worked in the utility sector many years. Question I had is regarding you mentioned privacy in several of the slides of information. And what I wanted to ask is the privacy, since the many utilities are public sector, public-owned, or privately owned utilities, how does that influence your statistical base and findings? I'm just curious about that, and if that's what you meant by privacy.
Yeah, so that's a great question, and it's an interesting one for this sector because, as you said, there are such a large number of utility businesses that are privately owned as well as publicly owned. From a privacy perspective, we don't care. I guess that's the simplest way of putting it. With only 1 or 2 exceptions here at the Census Bureau, all of our business data are subject to the same Title 13 and Title 26 privacy protections that basically say that we are prevented from publishing data that would disclose the identity of any single business, any particular company. Those privacy protections, it does not matter whether that business is publicly held or privately owned. The only real exception to that are for government-owned and operated businesses. We do publish data in our public sector program on governments, on state and local governments. And yes, there are some state and local governments that actually operate their own utility businesses. And those data would then be available. The micro data would be available because, again, it's a government. It's a public administration. It's a public entity. But for privately held or publicly owned businesses, we don't care. It's the same exact privacy protection for both of them.
And our next question, your line is open.
Hi. I wonder, in American Fact Finder, there are the 2000 census as well. What happened when it retires? Can we find it in data.census.gov or somewhere else?
Right. So that's a great question. Right now, on the Economic Census side, we have migrated all of the 2012 Economic Census data over to the new data.census.gov platform. So at least for right now, you will have both 2012 and 2017 Economic Census data. And the same is also true for many of our other business surveys. We've migrated over annual data, for example, from the annual survey of manufacturers from 2012, 13, 14, 15, 16, and 17 over to data.census.gov. For data prior to 2012, there's really 2 ways that you can get access to that data once American Fact Finder is sunsetted. The first way is by accessing it directly from our API. So we have been gradually putting all of these historical data sets, or many of them, out on our application programming interface. If you go to the Census Bureau's main website and go to our developers page, you will actually see a list of all the data sets that are available in our API. And you can go in and either download those data from the API, or even better, you can actually connect your own data tools to our API and have that data come down dynamically. We are really encouraging people to not just use the API as a download service, but instead connect. So that's certainly one way to get those historical data sets, and that's true not only for the economic census data prior to 2012, but even for many of our other programs where we are only putting data in data.census.gov for a certain point in time forward. So the first place is the API, and the second place is for data sets that haven't yet been loaded to the API. We are making those data sets available in FTP sites, in the good old-fashioned 1980s technology FTP downloads. I know it's not the most elegant way to access the data, but at least it will continue to give you access to those data. So, for example, we have the 2012 economic census data in both in both data.census.gov and the API. The 2007, 2002, and 1997 economic census data are available for download in our FTP site. So again, it's kind of a crude way to get at it, but that is a way to do it. I will mention one last point too, that we have a number of other partner organizations, including a number of major universities, that have decided to actually act as a repository for some of our data. And if you have any particular questions and want to talk about some of those universities that have done that for us, my email address is here on the slide, as well as my phone number. I'm more than happy to direct you to a couple of those universities and other providers that have decided to act as a repository to kind of assist us with that. So hopefully that'll help.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Again, as a reminder, if you'd like to ask a question, please press *1 and record your name. Our next question, your line is open.
Hello, Andrew. Just a quick question in regards to the miscellaneous subjects series. I see that the cost of purchased electricity for resales will be published. I was wondering if there would be a publication of the cost of natural gas for resale, if that will be published as well.
Yeah, so I think, where did I have that slide here? I thought I had them all listed here. Where'd it go? Here we are. So we do publish purchased electricity for resale, but I'm not aware that we are going to be publishing a similar miscellaneous subjects for cost of purchased natural gas for resale. I can check if you'd like to confirm that. Again, I would send me an email to my email address here, and I can confirm that. But I'm pretty certain that no, we're not going to have a miscellaneous subjects table for natural gas resales.
Thanks a lot. I'll definitely follow up with some additional questions regarding that, given the email that you sent, and I appreciate you giving the contact information out as well. Thanks again.
Sure, you're very welcome.
And I'm showing no questions in the queue at this time.
Okay, well, thank you all so much for taking time out of your busy days to attend this webinar. I want to remind everybody that this is the second of a 20-part webinar series. Every 2 weeks, we're going to be conducting one of these webinars. On Tuesdays, there will be webinars on it with a state-based basis, and every Thursday or every other Thursday will be a sector-based webinar that we will be conducting. The next sector-based webinar, which is scheduled for March 26th, will be on the transportation and warehousing sector. And I've already started pulling together the materials for it, and it looks like it's going to be a really interesting dive into the data for that particular sector. So I would encourage you all to check back on our webinars page and maybe join us on some of the other ones. So thank you so much for your time, and have a great afternoon.
That concludes today's conference. Thank you for participating. You may disconnect at this time.